Okay, Talina and Godfrey, you guys may introduce yourselves.
Rafi, you want to start?
No, you go first. Ladies first.
Okay. Good
Uh,
morning. Was
we're
somebody
good.
speaking? Okay,
No, no, sorry.
it's okay. Good morning. Welcome. I see folks are coming in. We're excited to get started today. I know we are giving a few more moments for some more families to come on. My name is Talana Jones, and I will be presenting along with my colleague Godfrey Rivera today from Center Here. I'm a parent advocate. You will learn a little bit more about me in a few slides, but we're waiting for folks to join in, and we are going to be talking about visioning work for your children and families. So we're excited for you all to join today.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Godfrey Rivera. I'll be, I guess, co-presenting with Talana Jones this morning. I'm with the Metropolitan Parent Center of Synergia. We are a federally funded parent training and information center. We help families that have children with disabilities learn about their rights and how to get resources for their children. And in this presentation, we're going to be giving you some information from Ms. Jones' point of view. She is a parent advocate, and she has children that have, special needs. And we're going to be giving you an overview of some of these points of information that are important for you to learn. So we hope that you benefit from the presentation, and we welcome your comments and questions.
Do you want to start at about 12:05 and give folks about 2 more minutes?
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Or do
Yeah,
we just want to just
a
jump right
couple more
in?
minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll start.
Okay.
Do you have this? Did you get the link? Okay.
So for those who are on, you're going to be muted throughout the webinar, but we hope that you will use um, the chat box to ask any questions, and we'll if we have time during the Q&A section, we'll go back to the chat box and try to address some of the questions that you all might put in there while you're listening to the information being presented. And whatever we don't get to today, we look forward to following up and sharing the answers to anybody who registered for the presentation today. Does my sound okay, you guys?
We're good now. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes, and then we'll start the program, okay?
Okay. So it's 12:06. And I know we have a lot of things to cover, so and we hopefully wanted to have time for some Q&A. So we're going to go ahead and get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this is today's agenda. We already did our welcome. You will also be able to see some pictures of me shortly of who is actually talking to you today. We will be going over the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Then we'll talk about developing meaningful service and educational plans. We'll have a bit of an activity that you all can do wherever you are, whether you're at home or if you're listening from work, given some of the strategies that I share. And then we'll debrief and bring it all together and have opportunity for Q&A, hopefully. As I said before, if you have any questions while the webinar is going on, please type them into the chat box. We will do our absolute best to answer them during the Q&A. If we do not get to all of the questions, we will definitely send out a Word document to all registered attendees with the answers to your questions. So, my name is Talana Jones, as I mentioned before, and this is my family. My son Kareem appears in every photo, and so Kareem, and I'll refer to him as Tajay, which is his middle name pretty often, has a diagnosis of Down syndrome. We're in the Orange together, and we live in Syracuse, New York, but we're from East New York, Brooklyn. That is his cousin Taylor, who decided to move from Brooklyn up here with us in Syracuse so that they can go to high school together. And they go to Nottingham High School. She's in 10th grade, he's in 9th grade. And in the lower corner is Tajay's father. So just wanted to share a bit of who you were talking to. We had early intervention both in Brooklyn and in Syracuse, New York, and we've been here experiencing the Syracuse City School District since he was a kindergartner. And so I've navigated a few systems, both in different areas of the state. So, why do we advocate for the services for our children? The moment we have a child with a disability, as parents, we are expected to be our child's first and best advocate. This is not a bad thing. However, we're often getting information for the first time about a disability that we may or may not have heard of, but we have no clue as to what this actually means for our child's life. We then enter into multiple service systems such as early intervention, special education, or the front door office of people with developmental disabilities. People immediately tell us that we're considered partners at the table. That's also a good thing. But sometimes we don't even know what to ask for because we're still learning a lot about our newly diagnosed child. Or if we've had a child with a diagnosis for a long time, things might be changing. Puberty could be happening. You see new co-indicators or other parts of their disability that you may not necessarily know about. Or what does having a young child with Down syndrome look like versus having a 15-year-old young man with Down syndrome? What does that mean for them? And so it's important for us to think about the vision for their future, right? I think about when I first got the list for Tajay when he was born, and they told me everything. He had Down syndrome. I didn't know what that meant. They explained that it was an extra chromosome. But the list that the doctors gave of who he would be was much more detrimental to me. It was, he'll have issues with his eyesight, he'll have issues with hearing, he may have heart issues, he's more susceptible to leukemia. And I mean, I hadn't even held him in my arms, right? And so that was a struggle for me because that picture of him was this very medically driven diagnosis of who he was. And then I actually held him and I said to myself, well, this baby seems really awesome. And all of the things you named, while not terrible, the way you said it seemed like, he was something completely else, right? And really wasn't talking about him as a young little boy who just came into the world, who was deserving of loving and caring, right? So it made me sad, but I didn't get a chance to stay sad for long because I wanted to know how to help him. But it almost took away my dreams for him, right? Because if he couldn't talk and he couldn't walk and all of the things that they said he was going to have a hard time with, you kind of go, well, what does that look like for when they are in the world? And so I had to get my dreams back. I had to think about what dreams did I have for him when I was pregnant with him. What did I hope he would do? What did I want him to be when he grew up? Did I want him to find a job that he loved, a partner to grow old with? I knew I wanted him to have lots of friends and have great schooling experiences. I wondered if he would be like me and really love music, or was he going to work somewhere like his dad or grandmother working for, um, like human services. I had all of these thoughts, and I had to think about those once again. And so, have you asked your child, what do they want to be when they grow up? Those are the kinds of things that we have to remind ourselves when we're thinking about what it is that we're asking for when we're asking for services for our children. We're thinking about the future. And so, in order to know where we're going, it's often helpful to know where we've been. Families and self advocates, and if you're not familiar with the term self advocates, that is usually people who have a disability and are advocating for themselves on behalf of themselves. But they've been critical to the changes in the law around education over the last 60 years. And I think it's important for us to think about, so what has been available to us as before we think about how we utilize services for the future, and just have a sense of where we're coming from. One of the answers to the original question as to why we advocate for our children and families is because there was a time when things were very different for our children and adults with disabilities. And I dare say we are in a situation these days where we're struggling still to find services. But let's, go back for a second. So this is a quick overview of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And you may or may not have heard of the landmark cases that were part and parcel to the passage of what was originally called the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975. It was later reauthorized to be called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, both in 1990 and then again in 2004. But the reason I want to let families know about these two cases is because, one, we need to know that when we say that our children have the right to an education, this is explicit. These cases were won in a time when children with disabilities did not have the right to go to school. And so Park versus Commonwealth of Pennsylvania really was the first right to education suit in the country, and it overturned a Pennsylvania law to secure a quality education for children. It was the first significant challenge to laws around the country prohibiting or excluding students with mental disabilities from attending school alongside other children, or even in special programs tailored to their needs. Before this case, many states had similar forms of legislation in place to prevent children with mental disabilities from receiving a free public education. This is huge. When we think of the next case that I'm talking about is Mills versus Board of Education, which happened shortly after. All of the children in this case were African American. Almost 20 years after Brown versus Board of Education Topeka, where Brown versus Board said separate means unequal. You could have been a child who would have won that right, who would have won the right to attend education in a school of your peers in a desegregated school. But if you were still a child with a disability, that did not matter. You still had to follow many of the state laws that would not allow you to go to school. And I think that's just really prolific when we think about how important that is to even say that students with disabilities were still discriminated against well into 1975, which means that wasn't long ago, right? We're talking about less than 50 years at this point. And so, actually, no, we celebrated. How many years is it, Godfrey? I think my math is off. Did we just celebrate 50 years?
Hello, can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, I
Was it,
apologize.
or did
Yeah,
we
we're
just
getting
celebrate
very
40?
close to the celebration of this major landmark case that you're describing very well. Hmm.
And are we celebrating 40? It's 40 years.
40, 47, 49 years, something like that. We're getting pretty close to the
We're
50th
getting
celebration, right?
right. And can you imagine if, for families, as we think about this, I harp on it because I just think it's really important for us to think about as families of multiple backgrounds that, to have such a major civil rights case such as Brown versus Board of Education still leave out students with disabilities. And it needed to take almost 20 years later for students to still be able to have the right to go to school is really important. And that happened because families sued, right? Um, and that's really important because families have always been a major arbiter of change when it comes to these landmark types of cases. Um,
Yeah. Let me add something there quickly, Talana.
sure.
Parents have to understand that the only way that this legislation, this movement came around was because of parents. It was all initiated back at Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Parents were really upset that their children can go to school, and they got together, they organized, they petitioned, they marched, and eventually the power of their voice started to take hold on the local governments, and we started to have this legislation going. Parents cannot forget the power that they have if they organize and they work together for these common causes.
Absolutely. I think the other key thing, and thank you for that, Godfrey, because it absolutely was the pressure from families that really motivated Congress to act. So even after the lawsuits were won, right, because that was state by state, Congress had to then pass the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And so that required all types of advocates who were a part of early childhood, but most importantly, families telling their stories about having to send their young babies to institutions. Well, we only have an hour today, so I kind of kept it more towards our educational history. But we would be remiss if we didn't say that if they weren't going to school, and you didn't necessarily have all the tutors to keep your children home, oftentimes that meant that they were sent into an institutional setting. And in some states, even those institutions were segregated, white versus black, or depending on what area you were in, the institution might be severely underfunded, which led to a lot of abuse and neglect of people of all ages with disabilities and institutionalized settings. And so it was a serious time, and families said that if our children would have the right to an education, then maybe they could become, productive members in society. And they have the right to participate. It was only right. They were children too, and that was really important for their lives, right? They had a vision for what they wanted for their children, and it wasn't to be continuing to be in institutionalized settings anymore. That doesn't necessarily mean it started out with, inclusive class settings from the beginning. But I think it's important to mention that, we had to get through the door, and it was only families that were pushing that door open collectively. And so I like to talk about this. My mentor often talked about what the Congress wrote at the beginning of the law about their findings. And this is huge because, again, back to what Godfrey mentioned, it was because families were telling their stories to Congress at hearings and giving their testimonials around what was actually happening for their children in the state, having to travel long distances in order to get to specialized schooling for, babies and for young children, and not being able to find anybody to educate older children. And so this is so key because I think when we think about our own vision for our children, and even as we assist other families, and maybe some of our advocacy, we need to know that this is written somewhere and that we can point to this. And it says a disability is a natural part of the human experience and in no way diminishes the rights of individuals to participate in or contribute to society. Improving educational results for children with disabilities is an essential element of our national policy of ensuring equality of opportunity, full participation, independent living, and economic self-sufficiency for individuals with disabilities. So again, when I asked you earlier, how do we see their lives? We want to be able to dream for our children and share with people as we create plans for them what our dreams are. If you want them to live independently, I am counting down the years that my son gets to 18. And maybe it's going to be 21. I don't know. Whatever year it is, I want him to go live somewhere without me. Right? But I have to think about, so if that's what I want, and I think at this point, at 15 years old, when he tells people that he's actually 18, I'm thinking more and more as we talk about his life, I'm sure he wants to live somewhere and not with me anymore either. Okay? So when we talk about full participation or being out in his community, we have to start thinking about those things right now, which means I've had to articulate at some point, this is what he wants for himself. And this is what I want for him to be a part of his surrounding community, to be living, whether by himself with assistance, but not necessarily under his mom's roof, unless that's something that your family does and that's part of your culture. That makes sense too. But it's all really based on kind of what your individual family like wants and needs, as well as what your children want and need. But you have to ask the question so that you can talk about how to drive your services to make that happen for you. Sometimes I'm a bit of a law geek, so I won't beat this into I won't beat this part in too much because I know it's a lot of things on one slide. But I thought it was really important that when we tell, it's important to go back to the purpose of IDEA, right? I use this as a tool in many of my advocacy meetings if I feel like sometimes if I don't feel like the team is all on board, I kind of remind people, how can I support you, support my student? Because really, this is what the goal of supports and services are supposed to do, right? And so IDEA is a federal law. It gives money to the states in order to implement multiple services and supports for children to access the general education curriculum. And it also outlines what the purpose of the law is. But I think A is super important. It's what we just read as it relates to what Congress wrote at the beginning of their findings, which is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free and appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet the unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. Those things are part of your plan, your IEPs, your individualized education plan, for a reason. When you talk about transition and whatnot from high school into their next stage of life, that is included in there because this is the kind of thing that a free, appropriate public education should be preparing them for. The goal of the law is also to ensure the rights of children with disabilities and the parents of such children are protected. I think the other key is that, they're responsible for providing all kinds of system improvement and coordinated personnel preparation. That's what we call professional development. And all of the things necessary to ensure that educators and parents have the ability to support school improvement activities. So these are all of the kinds of things that are codified in the law, or I should say outlined in the law. And so when you ask for these things, you're not asking for anybody to give you anything special. This is written and this is what's supposed to be happening. And it helps for us to know what Congress had a vision for when they wrote this law as well, because everything else after that is then what do you do in order to get there, right? And that's kind of the rest of the statute. So if you ever have time, you can go to the IDEA.gov website and check it out. It's actually, they have a great site. And I will say this. It's important to note that Congress also thought it was a matter of national policy to maintain a commitment to diversity and for states to pay attention to anything that would negatively impact students of color and their families. And so they recognize also in the statute, and I'm reading this word for word, that limited English proficient population is the fastest growing in our nation, and that the growth is occurring in many parts of our nations. And so greater efforts are needed to prevent the intensification of problems connected with mislabeling and high dropout rates among minority children with disabilities. So they've already said to states that we know that you are servicing children who speak multiple languages, specifically Spanish, actually. And they also identify the fact that for African American children who are identified as having intellectual disabilities and emotional disturbance, that states need to be paying attention to whether or not they're mislabeling them, and if they're not mislabeling them, ensuring that they have access to diverse providers, a diverse workforce, and that they should be collecting data on whether or not they are being suspended or disciplined at a higher rate than any of their white counterparts. And I think that's really important for us to know as families too, because that again is also in the statute, right? And so when we say that these things are happening, when we tell our stories about whether or not somebody is providing you a provider to come to your house, or you want to have access to a teacher who speaks the language that is your native language, that is the dominant language used in your house, you're not asking for special favors. You're asking for something that's in the law. Because why? You want your children to have access to the information that they need to have access to in order to have great educational outcomes. So just so you know, some of the goals for Part B special education, and Part B is Part B of IDEA. And that specifically outlines special education. And so we know that that's the individualized education plan. I should have written that out. Sorry about that. And it is the cornerstone of students' educational programming. As I mentioned before, it shows the students' level of performance. It describes standards. It describes the students' disabilities and how it would affect their or impact their general education program, or the involvement of their ability to be in the general education program. And it specifies services and how often. And while all of this is really important, I think it's also important to mention that it also talks about the least restrictive environment, and that once parents are considered to be equal members of the IEP team, then we have a right, a duty, if you will, to make sure that we share all types of information about our children. So not only the things that they can do or the things that they can't do, but more importantly, the things that you want them to do. It's also really imperative that even if you don't know what's happening or what's supposed to happen in second grade, or what are all the things that they're supposed to learn in fourth grade, that you ask the teachers to share that with you, so that you really are working as a team. Because if in second grade, you're really just kind of learning to read, but then by fourth grade, you're reading in order to understand. You're reading to comprehend, right? So now you're just not, people are not really focusing on teaching you how to read anymore. They're expecting you to read something and then tell them that you understand it. Those are two very different things. And if you don't know that there's a change as such, then it's harder for you to advocate for what they might help you with around literacy skills for your child. And so we don't know what we don't know. It's not like I expect that everybody would know that information, but it's important for us to ask those kinds of questions. Why? You might be an avid reader yourself, so you want to be able to share in reading time with your child. That's something that's super important to you. If you know that them being in the world and trying to get to more independent living requires that they need to be able to read some of the signs if they're going to be outside and crossing the street and being in the world, right? That's just a simple example. The other thing is math and, really kind of how to pay for things and all of that kind of stuff. And most people will name that as something that's functional, but we really can still have our children sitting in general ed classes or even specialized classes because there is a continuum of environments, right? Um, where they're utilizing that for a later part in their life. Again, after you've articulated why is it that you want them to learn the things that you want them to learn, and why is things like physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and all the other related services that are afforded to you, how is that going to assist them in getting there?
Okay. Excuse me for a minute, Talana. Just want to
Yes.
make a quick comment here. All this information is really important, but you should be aware of that when Congress wrote IDEA law, it was designed to meet the needs of individuals from birth through the age of 21. That's how long the supports last. And then they decided to divide the law into two components. You'll see that the slide here identifies Part B. Part B is designed for school-age children. That means from kindergarten through high school. There's
Yes.
another component called Part C, which is designed for preschool-age kids from birth through age kindergarten. So, because there are different needs for both populations, and the law is designed to make sure that the needs are met in an appropriate and effective way.
Absolutely. Thank you. Actually, that was my next slide. um, to talk about Part C, because Part C is early intervention, as Godfrey mentioned, and Part C covers birth to 3. Because children do not have the right, according to education law, to preschool, really the only thing in the law that talks about preschool is a section called 619, and it allows funding to go to states for children who are found eligible as a preschooler with a disability. We won't go too far down that road today, again, because I have our time is shorter today. But certainly, if you have questions about that, feel free to put that in the chat, and we can always expand on that. But the goals for early intervention really are a little bit different, because now we're talking about the developmental needs of your infant and toddler. And it really is an individualized family service plan, or an IFSP, because it is designed to assist the family. This is something where, when we think about how families impacted the law, Part C did not get added until 1986. Folks said, if you want us to have our children home, and they're not going to institutionalized settings, and they're not going to these state schools, then where can they go? And if they're going to be home, then we need help. We need somebody to show us how to work with our kids. We need somebody to help us coordinate services. I can't have I can't have a set of twins who has been diagnosed with a major feeding disability, or a health impairment, a lung impairment, and then be expected to also run all over the city and coordinate my own services. I have to go to the doctor, then I have to go over here and find a PT, and then I have to go over here and see if I can find some nursing or some feeding. Families said that doesn't make sense. We can't do that and also try to take care of our actual children at home. And many children have siblings. And so what does that do, and how does that impact the structure? Oftentimes you made decisions around sending your babies away because it was something that might have been helpful, or have enough support in order to do it at home, and what kinds of services were available during those times. And so early intervention was really in response to that, and maintaining the family structure, as well as helping the infant and toddler who had a disability, infant or toddler, excuse me, who had a disability, to increase their own functional abilities, gain independence and mobility, and be a full participant, not only in their community, but in their family, right? That's super important. And I think it also got them being, we knew more about early childhood in the 80s as folks was talking about intervening early made sense for all types of families, whether you were low income or a minority family who didn't necessarily have access to lots of books and other resources, that it is important that children got access to education earlier and they would be better prepared for when they entered into kindergarten. And so early intervention in the individualized family service plan is designed in that way. So what does this mean for families, right? Going down that road, what does that mean for families? If we think about why do we advocate for services, we know that our children face a number of hurdles being labeled with a disability, and that some people really do have low expectations about their future. And so even though we are seen as equal members of the team as it is in the law, we also know that if we are in a room as part of these teams, we know that sometimes not everybody is on the same page as you. Sometimes we might have a hard time seeing the future now that we know our child has a disability and that there is something that they may not be able to do. But if we think about it, it's so important for us to maintain our dream for who they are. This does not mean, and I really do not like the word being realistic. I don't like that phrase. I think we can be honest about the fact that our children may or may not be able to do something. We all have things that we can and cannot do. We know that some people have more issues that impact their ability to do things than others. So we have to talk about what it means to actually have a disability. You will see that I use the word disability throughout this and not special needs, because if you are a child with a disability and you're found eligible for, if you're a child with a disability, and I said labeled because you have to meet one of the classifications to even fall into a category under the IDEA, then that means you have specific protections. And I think it's important that we make sure that we name it as a disability, because that's where we get those protections. That's where we get our ability to go to due process and do all of the advocacy that we want to do. But I think when we talk about labels, right? What do the labels mean? If you know one child with Down syndrome, you know one child with Down syndrome. If you know one child with a chromosomal deletion, then you know one child with a chromosomal deletion. Our children, the reason those things are individualized is because really how that disability impacts their lives really depends on what other things they've had access to. And so that's why it's important that those plans are individualized, because then families can go in and talk specifically about what kind of resources they have, what kind of concerns they have, and what are their hopes and dreams for the future. So when you're creating these plans with your school teams, this becomes that much more important when you begin to set goals so that they can meet the goal of the statute, which was equal opportunity for participation in independent living. So how do those disabilities impact? How do they impact? How might they get in the way of those things? And then what can we do inside of the plans to help them kind of get over some of those challenges and barriers? So when we're thinking about meaningful outcomes, I think these are some questions for you to think about. Again, these are just strategies. This is helpful when you're preparing for your meetings, especially, this is the end of the year. So I don't know how many school districts, how many of you are still having your IEP meetings, but I do tend to think about this for the beginning of the school year as well. And if you are a family who have children in the early intervention program, I think this is something that you can talk ongoing with your child's service provider, your therapist, and even your service coordinator, but most definitely at your IFSP meetings. So questions for you to think about. What are your priorities for your child? What concerns do you have? Are they struggling at home or at daycare or in school? And if so, what time of the day is this happening? I don't know how many times in our assessment and evaluation meetings, does anybody ask you, what does your child enjoy doing? And what types of school subjects do they like? Are they doing well in somebody's class? Um, this question, what did you learn about your child from the evaluation and assessment, is my favorite question. Because usually when we hear information from the evaluation and assessment, it's about all of the things they can't do, right? Because oftentimes those evaluation and assessments are used to show that they are significantly delayed in order to be eligible for supports and services. But I think it's really important for families to ask, what did we learn about what they can do? Where were they successful? So if you said color these 4 animals, did they know any of the animals? Did they color inside the line? Were they able to identify inside when they were having the evaluation? Were they able to identify 2 if you just showed 2 of them versus 4 of them? These are the kinds of questions that your team could share with you, because they were the ones who did the evaluation and assessment. So this is a general question. What can you share with me? What did you learn about my child? What skills do they have according to the evaluation and assessment? And what could you share that helps my child when they're struggling? So that's the kind of thing. So when you did this evaluation and assessment, did you do something different where they had success if they had a hard time before? This is the kind of information that you can continue to use and share with your teachers, with your therapists, in order to continue to help your child progress forward. But you don't have to know everything. And I think that's really important. You can share your story about what happens in your family, what happens in your home, what you know about your child. But our children can sometimes be very different people when they're with their teachers, or like, taking a test and all of that good stuff. So sometimes we just have to ask the right questions. And I think these are pretty helpful questions. So what's a meaningful outcome? Meaningful outcomes are important to the family. They have to matter to you in order to be meaningful. If the outcomes that you create on your IFSP or your child's IEP does not center the needs of your child and your family, oh, I have a bit of a typo there, and your family, which is the individualized family service plan, or your child's educational needs, which is the IEP or the individualized education plan, then these are not meaningful. These are ones that can be, outcomes are ones that can be worked on by all team members, including the family. That goes for both your IFSP and your IEP. While they're talking about goals, sometimes you want that goal to be broad enough that if they're working on it in class, you also know how to work on it at home, and everybody could be working on it so that your child can have success. They should be clear about what success looks like. Everyone should know when your child is succeeding or has met the outcome, right? Because that outcome should be clear enough for and easy enough to read that we know what success looks like. They should be based on your child's strengths, of course, which means that's why you have to give that language about the positive parts of your child and their skills and their development that you see. And it should be written in a language that is clear and understandable to the family. So it should be jargon free. So this is just kind of a helpful way of thinking about it. And that's just what I just shared. So just some samples of a meaningful IFSP goal, because I don't like to talk pie in the sky and then you don't see what I really mean concretely about what that goal could look like. And so these are just a few. When sitting in a chair with arms or supports, and you name those supports, Ellie will feed herself using a spoon or a fork for at least half of a meal once a day. If you look at that outcome, do you know when she's met success? I think that's super clear, right? And you may say, well, why is it so specific? Well, you want to be specific because this is the kind of thing that can be generalized over time. But this is something that you're specifically working on. Why? Because you might have identified that in the morning, you have a tough time with breakfast. And that impacts everyone getting out the door in the morning. And so you really need for her to work on feeding herself without any assistance from you, whether it's using a spoon or a fork, right? For her meal, because that allows you to do other things in the house. It also is working on Ellie's independence, right? And so you're also talking about how she's going to do that. She'll be sitting in a chair, and we recognize that at this point, Ellie might need support for her to sit up in a chair. That's also something helpful that anybody can do, whether she's in a daycare setting, they could be working on this goal using different types of supports. And this way, you know, depending on the supports, whether pads or the footrest is better. You could be working on that as a family. Your PT could be, your physical therapist could be sharing with you what kinds of supports and where you could get them. I remember at one point, we didn't want to buy anything specialized because he was growing so fast. So we used a pool noodle for his support in a high chair. It actually worked really well. It was my PT's idea. And you know, so multiple therapists could work on that IFSP goal. And so that's important because you want them to have this kind of broad scope so that everyone can work on them, but be very specific about answering a concern that families have identified. And these are two others. When Shanika gets home from grocery shopping, she will walk up the driveway by herself. Again, encouraging independence. She's got out in a community setting. And you know, we all know when she has success on her own, Jacinia will play with a variety of toys and materials, such as pretending to cook, play with dolls, etc., at least twice a day. Especially if Jacinia was about to transition into preschool, this is the kind of thing that would have her on board and ready to go once she enters in a preschool setting where they do this type of play in school. So she would be working on being more successful in that setting. And so if you wanted to take a second and maybe try writing an IFSP goal for your child or family, remember these strategies. You think about what your priorities are for your child and family. You think about, do the outcomes address your concerns and reflect a real life setting such as the home or it's your surrounding community, such as the grocery store. And remember to focus on the positive. I often, because we're talking about our concerns, sometimes when we are thinking about what the IFSP goal could be, we tend to say things like, so that Daryl could stop yelling when he's not heard. He needs to work on his communication skills, right? Sometimes we have the impetus to want to write that down because that's our concern. And really, that's not what you want. You don't want to continue to talk about what they're not doing. You want to really have an outcome that is going to be what they're going to be doing. So using 2-word sentences, Daryl will communicate what he wants to eat for dinner, you know, like that kind of thing. And so that's the positive spin on it. And you, as always, you make sure your goal is written in a way that you're able to understand it. So even if you don't do that right now, I would love, if you do have an IFSP, to look at your outcomes and see if, one, they had any of those, if they look like anything that I mentioned here, and then 2, if they really did address your priorities and your concerns that you shared with your team. And are they written positively and in a way that you understood? And I just think it's important for us to always understand what a meaningful and high quality goal is. And so these are just important notes. These outcomes are able to happen in 1 year. They have a specific time noted. It includes your family's inputs and concerns. And it also mention whether or not there needs to be some assistive technology, low tech and high tech, and if it supports specific to your child and disability, and or if they need English language learning supports happening. So what's a meaningful IEP goal? That's a goal that's written in that is a goal written in plain language and is jargon free. Again, same thing, emphasizes the positive, It describes a child's involvement in age-appropriate activities. It's measurable, it's observable. Everybody needs to understand what it means once your child has that success and when they get there. And they will talk about what is it, what are the conditions under which the child will have the goal, demonstrate the goal, but they do not name a placement or an educational environment. That does not need to be in the goal. You talk about the outcomes first, and then you talk about setting. Setting does not happen before you talk about outcomes. Right, Godfrey?
Very true. Very true. Yeah.
Right. That should be your goals, your outcomes should be the driver of the conversation, and then where they're happening is the next piece. And so this is a sample of some IEP outcomes. So at least twice a week, Esmeralda will share details with her friends about recent activities using 3 to 4 complete sentences. You might say, this is not education, this is not an educational outcome. And I would say it absolutely is, right? She's talking about recent activities. She's using 3 to 4 complete sentences. Oftentimes, there are all kinds of things that happen where the teachers ask for the students to share what happened over the weekend, for them to share things that they've learned recently. And this is something that she can build friends with, build peers with, move towards belonging, feeling like she belongs in school, increasing her speech. Also, using complete sentences, which means at some point she might just have been using one complete sentence, or she's still learning how to use a complete sentence. But this way, this goal is broad enough that she's building on this throughout the year. And we're also embedding how can she have some strong peer supports as well, because we know that the research has said strong peer supports and having a sense of belonging in school also helps towards our children's educational impact and outcome. And then the other one is by the end of the school year, Isaiah will raise his hand, will address and answer a question related to the current lesson, a minimum of 3 times a week during English class. This one is a little bit longer. Data will be collected on the goal 1 time per week using a frequency measure. That last sentence I kind of threw in there because remember when I said it needed to be jargon free? This has jargon. But you may need data to be collected, right, on how often this happens, because you might be looking for something else to see a trend, but that doesn't need to be in the outcome. This could be somewhere else in the IEP, but not necessarily the outcome, because the outcomes are talking about the things that you want your children to do. This is talking about what the teacher should do.
Right.
And same, I would love for you to look over your IEPs and see if you have a number of concerns, it's important to prioritize outcomes. So if you have a lot of goals on your IEP right now, it really may help you to go back to your team and say, can we focus on the top 3 or 4 that is the most critical? Or maybe there might be outcomes that you can combine and work on. Versus having long lists of lots of goals that may or may not be getting met, right? And so I think that's really important because there could be a lot of things going on, but that's everything right away. So be flexible. Share your concerns with the team around other issues, especially toileting, how your child gets along in the classroom, how they communicate with their peers, as well as whether or not they have any other independent kind of living skills issues. Again, because that means that you're talking about how else will they be supported in class if they need assistance going to the bathroom, if they need assistance communicating with their peers, because usually if they need assistance communicating with their peers, they need assistance communicating with their teachers. And these are just kind of just a reminder of some of the things we don't necessarily bring up when we're only talking about curriculum and what they need to be learning in school. Again, ask your team to help you understand what type of learner your child is. So when they have the assessments, the same thing as I mentioned before, tell them to share with you what, are they visual? Do they respond more when things are written on the board or written on a piece of paper in front of them to have as a reminder? Or are they audio? Do they need to hear something a few times before they really get it? Right? And so who can be responsible for maybe repeating that to them? These are kinds of things and how you build the plan, and the plan actually comes to life to help assist your child with achieving their actual outcomes. And I don't want to underestimate this question of how can they build relationships with their peers. As I said before, it impacts your child's sense of belonging and ultimately their academic outcome if they do not feel like they have that they belong in school, or that they're not successful at creating friendships. Sometimes, and that means if they want to, right? Because that's important. That's important that you ask your child if they want to. Um, Sometimes that really does impact self-esteem, and then can really impact how they're doing in their work. And that's the time when you can really have the IEP team think about ways to set up different peer connections, because I think that's really important when we think about friendships over the long term, to be intentional about being able to create spaces for them to have friends and what that looks like. And it's not outside the realm of the school, the scope of education, to think about that and plan for that, especially if you are living in a community where children are all going to the same school from the same community, because it also helps build community outside of school. And share your dreams with the IEP team. The IEP is a means to an end. So how will the skills that your child learned in school help them be employable, connect with friends, prepare for college or trade, and live a quality life? Or anything else your vision for your child includes, right? Did you have anything to add, Godfrey, before I wrapped up?
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, your discussion about IEP goals are really important for first to understand. The IEP goals are the heart of your child's IEP plan. You need to be involved in that conversation. We explain goals as expectations that we have for our children, whether they're educational, behavioral, linguistic, or whatever, if the child receives the necessary supports and services. And the whole point is to show how we want our child to better his or her skills and understanding, how to demonstrate progress. So please get involved with the IEP goal conversation. Ask questions. You please ask as many questions as you have to, so you have an understanding to make sure that this plan works well for your child and for you too.
Exactly, for you too. I know a lot of people say that because it's an IEP goal, it's about your child's educational outcomes. That is true, but we know that schools ask for parents' engagement, right? And so we'll be talking in another webinar coming up soon around leadership and advocacy, where we can talk about ways to engage with schools. But I think it's really important that, your first set of advocacy skills are honed in with and about your child, and asking the types of questions that you don't have to know every single thing in order to ask these questions, and make sure that people answer them, because when people have to answer them, sometimes you find out way more information that they might have just shared because they might have expected that you knew, or they don't have to talk about it, so they might have missed it. And please ensure that you're asking for that information in the language that you speak in, so that you have the best opportunity to understand the information that is being shared to you. You have the right to do so. And so, as I wrap up, I always like to remind folks that all children are unique with their individual strengths and talents. The presence of a disability is not the defining characteristic of any child. Children grow and develop in the context of relationships with their families and caregivers, and they have the right to belong and to be welcomed and to fully participate in their community and in their school. And this includes all aspects of their community. Families and self-advocates have been so critical to help the nation at all levels have a vision for what it looks like to have an opportunity and access for people with disabilities and the people who care for them. The lives of families are always enhanced when they are successful in maintaining everyday lives. their child. When we have a strong vision for the lives of our children, services and supports become a way to get there. Ultimately, our advocacy, as well as helping them dream for themselves, will be so critical to the outcomes of their lives. And so please go ahead and review your IEP goals, review your IFSP goals, and even if you're goal setting with folks over with your care coordinator from the Office of People with Developmental Disabilities, continue to talk about the visions that you have for them and ask questions about how folks can support you, support that vision. And I think that you would have some very interesting conversations when you ask that type of question. How can you support my student? What kind of services can we ensure that they have so that they can have their best life? We know it's a free and appropriate public education. You don't have a right to your child having the best life. But I think when we are talking in those meetings, we can help people dream with us and vision with us and have a vision with us so that they know that those plans are more than just some paper to file away, but that they're really kind of a roadmap to helping us get there. And so with that, I want to say thank you to those of you who joined today. I always appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to families about this. This is something that I really, really love doing. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I've been doing this now for 10 years in some other capacities, and I've helped and assisted a lot of families in their IFSP team meetings, their IEP team meetings. And I know one thing, when a family has a strong vision for who their child is and they share that, we kind of get through even some of the toughest challenges inside of a conversation. So I wanted to be able to share that with you. I wanted to be able to share a little bit of history so that you know families have always been critical to changing things for their children, especially for children with disabilities. They've been at the core of the movement. Your stories, your advocacy is so important. And so we'll continue in the next webinar to talk about how to develop those. Any questions? Did I miss any chat questions? Do we have any?
We only had one question, and was regarding when you asked about the age. Sorry, hold on. Someone raised their hand. It says, "Thank you very much, Mrs. Jones. You learn something every day." It says, "My IEP meetings always seem like a wrestling match because I feel the expectations for my son are low. I saw my son go from doing 2 plus 2 with pictures to solving algebraic expressions in the space of 3 months. But now that he is in high school, I can seem to get through to the new team. How do I address that?"
Oh, wonderful. Not wonderful that it feels like a wrestling match. Wonderful that you asked the question, because I kind of came up against the same thing as my son entered into school. And what I ended up doing was asking this question. I said two things. I said, I need folks to be honest about their ability to assist my son with an intellectual disability inside your school. This is what I told the IEP team. I asked for specifically all of his teachers to be present. And it was at the beginning of the school year. It was before related services kinds of starts. I tried to get to them before the school year starts to see if, maybe they have time in August. I try to send out an email ahead of time. But if that doesn't work and we have to just prepare a date for when September starts, I try to get to them as early as possible. And then I asked the adults in the room, how can I support them, support my child? Really, because I think people are not always forward with the fact that they may not necessarily have all this, they don't necessarily always have the skills to support your children inside the classroom, or they don't know, they may need more resources, or they have other questions that they haven't asked anyone, right? And so if you have specific goals in mind and you share that information about the number of games that your child had, and really asking someone to say to you, can you tell me, if you look at his assessments, can we all look at where this might have changed, right? Sometimes that's talking to the old team. So specifically, if that's in math class, maybe having a conversation with the math teacher about where did he begin to struggle, what was happening at that time, so you can inform the new team about what to look for. And also asking, what are the expectations in the class? What do they expect him to do? And how can you support his ability to sit in class and learn these new kinds of skills? What else needs to happen for him, right? Because sometimes we get caught up in the related services conversation of OTPT, speech, etc., that we don't necessarily begin to talk about what high school really centers on, which is curriculum, right? If he has a specific type of literacy skill or literacy level, and all of a sudden the math class is now all word based, and that's the pressure point because his literacy is not up to par. And I'm sorry, that's not what I should say. His literacy skills level, then he's going to struggle in math. Or it might be the way that the teacher teaches. It might be, you know what I'm saying? If he needs some extra assistance, that this is going to be the year that even if he didn't have it before, he might need an opportunity to reteach because of the pace of the class. So there are a number of things happening where you can ask the new team, the old team, excuse me, what did they see happening last year, and really share that with the new team and tell them to be explicit with you about what are the expectations and how, given your child's current disability, with his strengths and some of his challenges, how can they be forward about what should be the next steps for him. I hope I was clear, because I would love to talk to you more about that too. But making people answer the questions, making people give you more information. It's helpful to talk to the old team. It's helpful to talk to old teachers, and really, especially once the year is over, to see if there was something else that could have been done that they just didn't have the opportunity to do.
So we have two more questions. It says, thank you for the presentation. It's very informative. My son is 30-year-old, nonverbal, profoundly intellectual, developmentally disabled. I have seen my son grow and want to have him reevaluated. I want to dispute his speech evaluation, which contradicted his nonverbal communication and his life plan. How can I best advocate for him?
Can you read that last part one more time?
Give me 1 second. It says, I want to dispute his speech evaluation, which contradicts his nonverbal communication and his life plan. How can I best advocate for him?
The life plan? How old is, oh, so hard.
She said it's 30.
He's 30. Did you want to take that, Gottfried? Hello?
Sorry, I'm sorry. One thing that the parent can consider is getting in contact with agencies in wherever she lives. In New York City, we have something called Access VR, which is part of the New York State Education Department, and they have all kinds of services and programs that are designed to work for individuals that are, post school, that already have finished their, educational component of their life, In terms of of doing evaluations to identify uh, what their interests are and what and work on that to develop life plans which can include uh, preparing preparation for college or learning a skill and whatever. But there, every state has agencies that the parent can contact her parent training information center. Every state has one of those. They should be able to offer her or him resources that could be used to develop more appropriate life plans for her, for their children after they finish high school.
I think that's so critical. Thanks for sharing that resource, Godfrey. I think the other thing is, um, anytime you have the ability to dispute something, make sure that you read whatever. If they haven't given it to you in writing, um, there should always be the process of appeal if you disagree. So I would definitely utilize that process. And when we talk about all of the reasons why you would disagree, uh, put that in your appeal. Put that in your appeal, absolutely, and then send that forward. But I think you absolutely, if you disagree, we don't always use our due process rights, and I think we definitely should more often than not. Not because we need to know all of the systems, but because we need to share the reason why we disagree written down and sent and have it documented in the same way that the life plan that you disagree with is documented, if I heard the question correctly. You said there was another question?
Someone said, someone mentioned, hello?
Yes.
Someone wants to, Godfrey, for us to repeat the Access VR information.
Okay, let me. It's an acronym, and I always forget it, but I'll give it to you in a second. Please hold. Okay.
In terms of questions, that's pretty much,
Okay. All right. Access VR stands for Adult Career and Continual Education Dash Vocational Rehabilitation. As I indicated, it's part of the New York State Education Department, or you could just put into your Google window ACCES-VR, and it'll go right to their website. There's an office in every borough of New York City, and they also service the entire state of New York. So you should be able to find an office near your locale and with some contact information. You need to call to make an appointment to talk to one of the counselors there so you can address your needs. And they should help you put together a list of resources and, to make sure that your individual, your son, your daughter who's post school, has opportunities to engage in a beneficial life as possible. That's the whole idea of IDEA, to make sure that our children, when they get out of school, can engage in a productive, meaningful, happy life, just like any other individual.
okay, we
Thank you
don't
for
have any more
sharing.
questions.
Okay. All right. So we are at 1:15. Thank you everyone for your time today. Thank you, Mirka Perez, for your assistance with the webinar and sharing questions. Thank you, Godfrey Rivera from Sinahia. Both folks are from Sinahia, for definitely giving that extra emphasis on information that we needed. And I appreciate all of you and your time and attention and questions. Those were really great questions. And I hope that you have learned a few things, got a few strategies that you can take with you and actually use right away. Don't forget to review some of your plans, given some of the strategies that I've shared, and let me know if anything else. if we need to follow up in any other way.
Great. I'd like to thank you very much, Talala, for your wonderful information, and I really appreciate that it came from a real life parent. Because you're living this. This is part of your daily existence. So I appreciate your perspective and your wonderful information, and also thank you, Mika, for your tech support. You made it
No,
happen. We appreciate that.
no problem. Thank you, guys.
All right.
Okay, take
Have
good
a
care,
wonderful
everyone.
day.
Bye bye.
Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.